Welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about gender, sex, the difference between those, and what it means, how it plays out in society. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, our outline for this chapter, we're going to talk about the differences between sex and gender, the different perspectives on gender, like why gender exists and how it's useful, things like that. Um, what else? We'll talk about how we become socialized into our gender. Like, why do boys act like boys and girls tend to act like girls? Gender at work and what that means, and then talking about women's educational advantage. Some interesting things about that probably haven't thought about before. All right, so let's talk about sex and gender here, how they're different, and the differences, at least we'll start with physical differences between men and women. And so sex, when we're using sex, it's different from gender. It's not the act of sex. It is biological. It's a biological category. It is assigned at birth, and then it remains influential throughout life. Whereas gender refers to a social category. So you can think about it that as a lot more flexible. So for instance, what it means to be a man today may be different from what it meant to be a man 40 years ago. Okay, so sex is a biological category that is male or female. Don't say man or woman, those are different. Male and female, you can think about it that as a category like if you were in biology class and you were looking at like fetal pigs, right? And they were like, what is the sex? You wouldn't say man, right? You would say male, right? You wouldn't say woman, you would say female, okay? It's based on anatomy and physiology, the function of those different organs, hormones, external genitals, internal chromosomes. Okay, gender is the social realization of biological sex. What does that mean? So if this is your biological sex here, gender is on top of that, saying, what does that mean? What does it mean in society to be a man? To be male. What does it mean in society to be male? Okay, well, that's the man gender, right? It's okay. So in society, if you're born, right, if your sex is that of a male, right, born with penis, right, different anatomy. Okay, what does that mean in society? Well, it means that they're more likely to expect you to eat meat. They're more likely to allow you to interrupt. They're more likely to pay you more, right? That's all gender. It's a social realization. When we get together other people, having a certain biology category means different things. They're going to treat you different. They're going to, talk to you different. They're going to expect different things of you. How am I doing here? I don't know. Um, okay, but who are we? Right. Okay, so the society can say one thing or another, which we primarily go along with, 99% of the time. Um, but gender identity is this identification with the social category, right? There are people who don't go along with the category that is assigned to them at birth, boy, girl, that sort of thing, right? We'll talk about transgender in a few slides later, right? But for now, know that it's this internal identification with the social category. I identify with this category or that category. Um, I am then going to express that in a pattern of outward behavior. Okay, what would this look like, for example? Okay, so if I identify as a boy when I'm 8 years old, right? So that's my gender identity as that as a boy, and I'm going to express that by playing with GI Joes and big trucks and playing with blocks and playing kickball, right? That's my gender expression. I might wear darker colored clothing, right? I'm going to wear t-shirts and shorts as opposed to a dress and I don't know, something else, right? It's my outward expression, my a pattern of behavior. right? I'm going to be encouraged to take up more space. Right? If you've ever looked at how boys and girls sit, right? Men tend to be more expansive. Women tend to be less expansive, be smaller. Okay. All right. When the sex and gender identity don't correspond. Okay. So for most of American history, not including the Native Americans, they had a gender category that was not man or woman. They had one, at least that I'm aware of, called two-spirited. That the idea of like the man and the woman exist in this one person. They have two spirits inside one person, right? But and I love prefixes, and that helps me understand things. So I'm just going to talk about those. So to be non means not, and then binary. Binary refers to two, right? Like a bicycle has two wheels. And so to be not part of those two categories of man and woman. No, there we go. Sorry. Male or female. I don't really like that. I want to push back against the publishers on that one. But anyway, we'll play along here. To be non-binary is your gender identity isn't male or female, right? Again, it should not be male. I'm sorry, this is wrong. And I know this is my slide, but I didn't make this one, right? It should not be male. It should be not wholly man or woman, right? Because this is about gender identity, not sex identity, okay? And there's a difference for me. I don't know if anyone else cares, but this is for me. So your gender identity is not either man or woman. Okay, so like you're not corresponding to either one of those. You know, you're some other category, right? Okay. Moving on. Transgender. So again, here the trans refers to change gender. And what are we changing? We're changing the gender that was assigned to us at birth. Right? So these are individuals whose gender identity does not match their assigned sex. Right? So their assigned sex was there. I don't know why I like blocks. Just helps me understand. And then traditionally, right on top of that, people are saying, okay, so if you're this sex, then you're this gender, right? And it's an automatic, although that's changing. A lot of pushback, so I don't know if it's going to continue to change, but so they're saying, okay, so if you're born with a penis, that's your sex, right? Then that makes you a boy. That's your gender. But there are people who say, I'm not a boy. I understand that I was born with a penis, but I am not a boy, right? Maybe I'm something else, right? Maybe I'm a girl, but maybe not. There's a lot of different other categories that are, again, socially created. And so it's in some ways it's like race, right? It's a social category based upon biological manifestations, right? So you could say that gender's like that, right? Okay, so they're changing it to something else. Okay, so moving on. So let's talk about the differences between males and females. Okay, and the focus here is males and females because we're talking about sex, right? So we have variations in the XY pattern. So women are born with XX on their, I think it's a 27th chromosome there, and then males are born with an XY on their 27th, right? So there are variations to that, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But fetuses begin identically regardless of sex. So like when a child is first conceived, they are identical, and they're identical for a little while. And so it's not like you can immediately tell upon conception, the meeting of the sperm and the egg, what sex that fetus is going to be. You can't tell that. And so what else? Men and women are not opposite sexes. We didn't start saying that until the Industrial Revolution, in which we had men going off to work in the factories and doing all this dirty work, and women are staying home with the kids. And like the difference between those jobs were way more different than they were previous to the Industrial Revolution, when both men and women were both staying home. So they're different. Right? It's obviously different. You have external genitals, you have other like secondary sex characteristics like body hair and Adam's apple and other things. Men tend to have much more muscle mass in their upper bodies than women do, and there are certainly sex differences, but it's not opposite, right? Like men have 10 fingers and toes normally, and women have 10, and like like 2 ears, and like most of us, our bodies are pretty similar, um, but we've said opposite sex to kind of like that's our social construction, like that's what we've said as a society, like society kind of comes together and agrees that they're opposite. But okay, so as humans we have differences between the sexes, like most other creatures, um, and the difference, the level of difference between the males and the females is referred to this as sexual dimorphism, right? And so as a species, we're actually low on the sexual dimorphism. If you think about other animals, that are you know, two cardinals, for instance. Like one of them is red and I think the other one is gray. And it's much more obvious as to which is which. If you think about female tigers as compared to male tigers are much larger than females. And so when you compare males and female humans, we're actually much more similar than other creatures. But we do things to exaggerate the differences. Like we dress male humans differently than we dressed female differences. We put females in funny shoes to make their hips and their chests accentuate and move more, to again kind of exaggerate those differences between the two groups. What am I talking about here? Let me show you. So elephant seals are a great example of a species of animal that has a high level of sexual dimorphism. If you compare the male seal versus the female seal, I mean, it's almost like this is a child in comparison to the male there. This is a painting that really accentuates the differences between these two people, but probably in reality they were much more similar, especially if you think about the level of her shoulders as compared to his. His are much, much broader. This really accentuates it. It's animation, but still it kind of gets into our head and we start thinking that like, males are supposed to be, so much larger, and think about the size of his legs as compared to the size of even her chest, right? It's like it's so much larger. His legs are so much larger than her whole body, right? Like she's half this. I guess she's about roughly the size of one of his legs. Now I know that I didn't see the movie, but I think he's actually not like a real man. I think he's a demigod, and so maybe it's a bad comparison. But I think that like children get the idea from watching this that like real men, are supposed to be tough and big. Look at him, and women get the message too, like, oh, we're supposed to be small, so here's a height distribution of men versus women, and what you can see here is that for women the median height here is 5'4", and then for men it's 5'10", so there's a 6-inch difference between the height of males and females. I don't know what that is as a percentage, but there's a lot of overlap here, where you have a significant number of men who are roughly the same size as women in height, and then women who are, roughly the same size as men or larger in height than women are. So here is a picture of Princess Diana and her husband Charles, and it looks like Charles is massive, like you could eat apples off of her head. But the truth is that they had him stand on a stool to take this picture, and that's why it looks so dramatic here. He's only about 1 inch taller than she was. And so here's another thing: common bathroom symbols, and here you have the fairly similar. Actually, the author points out that the shoulders of males are larger, but I don't know if that's. I guess the depiction is not always accurate, but it accentuates rather than minimizes average sex differences. So I guess the conclusion you could come to is that we are interested in accentuating, making larger the differences between those two things. All right, changing technology to accentuate these differences. Cosmetic surgery often enhances the differences between men and women, right? This was a book, I don't know if any of you have read this, called The Uglies. And in this book, when people turn, I think it's 18, if you can afford it, everybody gets surgery to make them, these like hyper beautiful people. To in this one, it's not really about like women versus men, but it's actually like poor versus rich, because only the rich can do this. And so what you have are, the rich people walking around who just look like models, all of them, and then the poor, they just look normal, like normal humans, and so it's very obvious to tell. And so in some way, that's kind of like what we do with gender differences, where we're encouraging people to look more different. What else we got? All right, so the most common surgery for women is breast augmentation and then lifts. This has actually doubled in the last 20 years. It's expensive. Oftentimes your insurance company does not cover it because it's not medically necessary, and it creates an inequality because poor people can't do it. So. All right, intersex children. So I think I mentioned this earlier about intersex. Not every child is born where the doctors can tell what the sex of that child is. And so an intersex child is a chromosomal composition. When chromosomal, think XY or XX. That's an X right there. XY. Does not correspond with sexual anatomy at birth. So maybe the child is male here, but you can't really see a penis. Or the child is not really clearly male or female. I've looked into this. Some people say it's very common, more than 1 in 100. Other people say it's actually not common at all. I couldn't make heads or tails of that. What I do know is that, just from stories that people have told me, is that oftentimes when you can't tell initially, if you give it a little while, like for instance this person, if you give it a few years, then this person will grow a penis. And so they can do surgery, and they used to do surgery because there was a lot of pressure on the parents to kind of like, was it a boy or a girl? Is it a boy or a girl? And like, that kind of thing. And so they'll sometimes start cutting, but they recommend now to not do that, to wait. The decisions to assign gender is usually based on genitalia rather than on hormones. So when we're talking about people who are transgender, it's good to know what gender affirming care is, because this is one of the areas that oftentimes comes up in the news and people are talking about this. So gender affirming care, if you just look at the words there, right? To affirm means to support, right? So to support that gender, that gender transition is really what that's about. So transitioning or changing from the gender that was assigned at birth to the new gender. So gender affirming care is going to refer to treatments to support the person's transition. So this would range from surgeries to speech therapy, laser hair removal, hormone treatment, breast removal. Okay, let's also talk about the difference between transgender and gender dysphoria. I mentioned transgender earlier. Transgender is to change from the gender that was assigned at birth to another gender. Gender dysphoria refers to anxiety, fear, depression, other mental health symptoms that are related to this issue. If the person doesn't feel like they fit in their body and they are distressed about it, or they're being teased by other children and they're turning inward and they're having distress, that is what gender dysphoria is about. All right, gender identity and the laws. And so there's been a lot of talk in the news, on social media, and places like that, um, relating to the fact that there's an increasing number of young people identifying as transgender. If you were to compare young people today and the number of people who identify as transgender, and you were to compare it to other generations, it is much, much higher. Okay, so that's brought it, whenever there's a larger number of people who are impacted by something, it's going to bring it more into the news. That it is not without resistance. You have more conservative groups who are trying to block and saying, wait a minute, this person who's potentially receiving this gender affirming care, think about hormones, it's probably the big one here. They are not even adults. And so do we want to give hormones? Do we want to give surgeries to people who are not yet adults, given the fact that some of these things are not reversible and they may have long-term side effects that, because they haven't been studied that much, uh, the scientific community may not be aware of that. And I'm sure there are some studies, but they're going to argue that there's just not that much. Um, so that's one area, talking about children, and so that's been an area of pushback. Public bathrooms, if somebody is identifying as male or identifying as female, but they were born another gender, what bathroom do they use? And this is not as simple as it may sound, because sometimes when people take hormones, if it's a person who was born female and they've transitioned to being a man, they may have a big beard, they may have a deep voice, they may look like a man, and they, you know, in some states would be told to go to the women's bathroom, right? Because conservative groups want them to go into that bathroom. But this is, anyway. What else? The other thing mentioned here is sports. That's like the third big controversy, is like if somebody is born male and then they are identifying as a woman and they want to run track or wrestle or something like that, what gender category should they be allowed to compete in? Social conservatives are concerned that recognizing transgender identity will undermine traditional gender roles, in the sense that, like, if people get to choose whether to identify as man or woman, then potentially women will begin acting like men and men will begin acting like women, and there'll be sort of like a social confusion around this. All right. Identity has legal consequences. You'll put on a passport one identity or another. Birth certificates or another area where some states are talking about, should we put the sex of the child on the birth certificate or not, right? And so there's legal battles going on over equality and social recognition. Um, the binary gender categories create inequality in people's lives. Again, that binary gender category is that of a man or a woman, right? Because some people are just going to say, like, neither one of those. I don't feel like a man or a woman, and you're forcing me to go into one or the other, and that just feels like a violation of who I am as a person. And so other conservatives are going to say, well, it's not just about you, it's about, like, you're living in a society with other people, and society has to be organized, and so we are going to force you to go into one or the other. Perspectives on gender. So let's talk about the different perspectives that we've learned about already. So biological perspective, they're going to focus on the fact that men and women are complementary. One person has larger muscle mass, and one person, therefore, they're maybe set up for hunting and climbing trees in a way that the other gender is not. Although I think women are probably pretty good at climbing trees, but certainly men have more upper body strength in their arms and muscles um, than women. I think it's 88%, something like that. Larger, and women are able to bear children, and so women females are able to bear children, right? And so because of that, there's a kind of the it leads itself to a natural role for women and a natural role for men, even though realizing that you're going to leave some people out, the idea is that it's going to serve the greater social good, right? That's the biological perspective, so that we're leading with biology. So like, okay, if you have this biology, that sets you up for these roles in society. Okay. Feminism. Feminists are going to focus on gender inequality and how women have always had less money, less access to power, less of a voice, less safety out, in their homes, certainly, in regards to families and things like that. And so men tend to set gender standards to serve their own interests. Right? And so they're going to focus on the fact that biology, while they're going to acknowledge biological differences, they're going to say it has been used to justify inequality, to justify subordination of women. And so, they're saying like, yeah, you're taking a molehill and you're making a mountain out of it. Rigid gender roles and expectations hurt women. Right, I just mentioned that, but they also hurt men and male identity. And so, for instance, a lot of men are lonely and they haven't met a new friend in the last year, and they are not sure who they are, what they're supposed to do, and yet male society says you should have it all together and don't cry and don't ask for help, figure it out on your own. And that's obviously hurting men a lot, right? It's probably one of the reasons why men tend to die younger than women do. Okay, let's talk about gender socialization. So uh, so there's a fairly new trend. It's not that many people are doing this, but it's out there, this non-binary parenting. And it's not just for people who are like hoping that their children are going to be transgender. What it is that parents who want their children to fit in and feel normal, even if their boy likes to shop and likes to play dress up, and their girl likes to play, with blocks and GI Joes. It's allowing children who would oftentimes normally kind of choose from a variety of different activities to decide what is for them. There are men who don't want their sons to like play shopping, but the reality is a lot of men will go shopping, and a lot of women are being taught to not rely on men, and so you need to learn how to change tires and fix a drain when it gets clogged, and so things like that. I think Target has mixed their toys together. If you go to the toy section in Target, you're going to find that there's not like a boy section and a girl section like there is in Walmart, but there's kind of all mixed together. So androgyny. Androgyny refers to a person who is neither exclusively masculine nor exclusively feminine. You could think about some famous people. Lady Gaga has like an alter ego in which she will dress more masculine, and this would be like an example of androgynous. You could think of other artists like David Bowie and coming out and on stage and looking pretty feminine, not exclusively feminine, but kind of a mixture of masculine and feminine traits. All right, parenting and gender socialization. There are clear patterns in how parents treat boys and girls differently. From a very young age, we think about our boys and our girls differently. Sometimes it begins even earlier than birth, where we talk to the fetuses before they're born, and we talked about them differently. Maybe women eat a little bit more meat when they're pregnant with a boy or something like that. And our expectations for them are going to be a little bit different. We're going to have different colors for them, different names for them. We're going to kind of imagine that they're going to be a certain type of person based upon their sex. So we tend to encourage more personal autonomy, more personal governance. We're going to let you make this decision, boy, where we may not let the girl make that same decision. What they get to eat, what they dress like, things like that. There was a study done where they took a black and white photo and they colored one of them blue and the other one pink. It's the same baby, and they didn't they only showed one of the photos. So like they would show this photo and they would say, "What's going on with this boy?" And people would say, again, they're not looking at this picture over here. They're just looking at the blue one. Like, oh, he's excited, he's happy, he's, industrious, he's adventurous, right? And then they would go to a new group and they would show them just this picture and they would say, "What's going on with this girl?" And she's like, "Oh, she misses her mother and she's, like wants to be with people and, like all these sort of feminine traits, and it's the same baby. It's just colored a little bit differently, and to kind of show that we have different beliefs about people based upon our assumptions about their gender. All right, parental socialization appears to be quite effective. we we're pretty good at turning out masculine boys and feminine girls. By age 3, girls are much more nurturing and caring, and boys are much more, rough and tough and interested in trains and trucks and tools. I suppose you could argue that this is due to nature, that they would have become this way regardless. That probably makes sense to me as well. It's hard to know whether it's nature or nurture. I assume it's a combination of both. Uh, Gender differences increase during childhood. Boys become more masculine and girls become more feminine. I feel like that's probably related to sexual reproduction, in the sense that neurologically we are wired to be attracted to certain versions of women and certain versions of men, and I think we kind of understand that, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so I think that's probably why it ramps up during childhood and kind of climaxes during adolescence and early adulthood. Gender socialization in the media. The media's got a big impact on us. We're going to focus on, masculine men who are very serious and tough and, lots of gear and, weapons of, I don't know, something to show that I am powerful and I have access to resources. On the other hand, women in movies and shows and music tend to focus on appearance and youth and beauty and I don't know, reproductive ability. Gender at work. We're going to talk about the causes of educational and occupational segregation, right? You women go over here, you men go over there, right? And how that leads to inequality. So one of the greatest barriers to equality between men and women began to break down when married women entered the workforce in greater numbers in the 1960s through the 1990s. Previous to this time, respectable women, middle class women, upper class women, even working class women were not supposed to be in the workforce if they were married, and certainly not supposed to be in the workforce if they had children. And so this began to break down in this relatively short amount of time between the 60s and the 90s, just 30 years, when you have increasing numbers of women joining the workforce. And when you have all these women joining the workforce, then they have power. They have economic power. It's probably one of the reasons why you saw a big increase in the number of divorces. It was already going up at that time, but you certainly now had the ability to live independently. Before that, it was very difficult. In the process, women's independence dramatically increased. I also think that men gave their wives more freedom because they were also bringing home a paycheck. The division of labor between men and women remains. Okay, so men haven't really caught up to these changes because women are still doing the majority of housework and the majority of childcare. That's changing, but it's really been a slow change. Occupational and educational segregation. By 2022, college-educated women outnumbered college-educated men by a margin of 122 women per 100 men. I think it's actually greater than that today. At Shawnee College, all across the nation, I'm sure there's a couple of exceptions, but by and large, you've got colleges that are like 60 to 70% women, and women are completing at roughly this, like at those levels. Like it's not just a ton of women who are joining and then dropping out. And there are some majors like computer science in which you've got a lot more men still in those positions, but by and large, college has become something that women are much more likely to engage in. Despite these changes, occupational segregation still exists, meaning at the top of companies, you still have a lot of men. And you have certain occupations, especially ones that are lower paid, that are full of women, and occupations that are higher paid, that are full of men. Again, those are changing slowly. Let's see. Women do work similar to their traditional unpaid work. Okay, this is interesting, I think. And I think this holds to the clue as to why women are still making a significantly amount of money less than men. And I think that's because that women's jobs, if you look at them, it's similar to what they already did as an unpaid worker. So if maybe 200 years ago, what were women doing? They were caring for children, they were serving meals, they were cooking meals, they were caring for people, they were serving men. Okay, well, now those jobs are paid, but it's similar to what they were doing 200 years ago. And I think in our collective memory, we're like, okay, women used to do this for free, so I don't want to pay them too much. I don't know, something like that. That's how the thought goes. So women and men tend to choose majors differently. Not our fault. We're oftentimes guided by society, what we see on TV, the books that we read, or what our friends are majoring in, what guidance counselors and parents and colleges will steer us in certain directions, right? Uh, Women's median earnings, the woman in the middle, if you line up all the women in America, right? The woman in the middle, she's making 83% of what a man is making, right? So it's still pretty low. It remains. Most of that difference, though, has to do with the fact that women are working different jobs than men. I give up on my arrow here. Women are working different jobs than men, and that is why it is different, right? There are differences, like if you go to like a workplace and you see like, well, women who are like have a bachelor's degree in business, are they making less than men? Some of them are, but most of that difference is just the fact that the women are not working in the business. They're working across the street in the daycare center, or they're the secretaries, whereas the men are the administrators or something like that. Here is a chart of women's earnings as compared to men. So if men are at 100, women are at a 60 here in the 1960s, and then it kind of goes down to the 1970s, but then it goes dramatically up. Women earnings changed a lot between 1970s and 2005, but then from then it's kind of flatlined, right, till today. And today we're about, I don't know, 83 cents to the dollar that a man is making. But that might change because in 2022, 45% of young women had completed a bachelor's degree or more as compared to 37% of men. So you have a lot more women, almost half of women are getting a bachelor's degree, and only about one of every three men are getting a bachelor's degree. So women are becoming increasingly more educated than men, and generally education impacts your amount of money that you make. So if you make more money, if you have more education, you're likely to make more money. And in fact, it happened last year. I found the information that if you look at 10 U.S. cities, the big cities like L.A. and Washington, D.C. and New York, and you look at just young women as compared to young men, what you see is that those women's earnings are greater than men's. Again, just young women as compared to young men, and it's only in a handful of urban areas, but it's happening, right? It's happening that women are making more money than men. So we'll see if that trend continues. We'll see if it spreads from the urban areas to the suburban areas, and then, 15 years later, it'll happen in the rural areas as well. So, alrighty, that is all. Thank you for watching till the end.